part of the Earglue Media family of podcasts.
You're listening to Petticoats and Poppies.
History Girls at the Movies.
Welcome to Petticoats and Poppies, History Girls at the Movies. We're your hosts, Maggie and
Nicole. Welcome to our 35th episode and our first Friendsgiving episode of this year. Today, we are finally talking about the 2019 film Little Women.
Last year, we had my friend Katrina Dennis on, as well as Ryan Showers, who is the host of Earglue Media's own Scream with Ryan Showers. This year, I wanted to bring on another one of my friends, Adam Lance Garcia, who is joining us today. And it's not just because he was recently called a renowned personality by a news site. Nothing like that. Earlier this month, his brilliant audio drama, Green Llama, premiered, and I thought this would be a great opportunity to introduce this audio drama to fellow historical lovers.
So first, we always ask our guests some questions just so that our listeners can get to know them a little bit. So, Adam,
yes.
What is a topic in history that you are interested in? It can literally anything.
One of my favorite versions of history. One of my favorite periods of history is the Civil War. It's something that I've always really loved learning about. It just blew my mind that there was this, that the country would be so divided that they went to war. I mean, that would never happen.
Never.
He laughs nervously. And I also really enjoyed World War II. I sort of basically the period from 1865 to sort of the 1940s, that whole run of time. The Victorian era is really interesting. The Civil War is really interesting. I love this period of time when the world is sort of opening up, technology is beginning to rise, and basically the entire world is shifting. It's a really fascinating, large period of time that I always enjoyed reading about and learning about. I mean, I was a history minor back in college, so it's I like basically almost anything up until the 1960s. Yeah. So it's a wide berth. I just like history.
That's so exciting. I think this does make you, because you minored in history in college, the first guest that we've had who has professionally studied history in any way.
Professionally is that's
okay, but who has
doing a lot of work.
Studied
history.
Yeah, you know what
I also went to film school, so 99% of what I did in college was basically, wow, I'm gonna go watch a movie. And, and then occasionally I'd go to a history class. That was basically it. So
that's basically the whole idea behind the podcast.
There you go.
Exactly. And that's also a perfect segue into the next question, which is, what are some of your favorite films? These are not the historical ones, just broad interests.
Broad interests. Obviously Star Wars, as anyone who knows me on social media, I'm a huge Star Wars fan. Have a really big soft spot for the Edgar Wright films, specifically the Cornetto trilogy. I love those. There's a few. I'm trying to think because it's a wide berth. I really enjoyed the Lord of the Rings trilogy, having rewatched it relatively recently. Though I wouldn't say it's my top favorite films of all time. I'm just sort of in awe that it was achieved. It has no right to be as good as it is. I'm trying to look. I'm really far away from my DVD collection, so I can't really look over there. I remember one of my favorite films growing up was the original Superman with Christopher Reeve, and that was a big. I look at a lot of the media I consumed and helped define me, who I am. It's never about the power fantasy. It's all about Superman's a good guy because he takes care of people. Luke Skywalker's a good guy because he doesn't use violence. All these little things that I grew up watching were a huge part of me. Indiana Jones. I really love. I like stories that. I like films that highlight sort of this sense of awe, entertainment, really taking us out of the real world. I love Wes Anderson films. because of the artifice that he creates in his films. The reason I love Edgar Wright is the thought he puts into every single shot, every single transition. It's like my taste in history, my taste in cinema is relatively broad. I'll go see an indie film as much as I'll probably go see a big blockbuster.
That's great. And so then, of course, with this being the podcast that it is, we have to ask, what are some of your favorite period films?
Favorite period films? I mean, obviously Little Women, that's why I'm here. Yeah. That goes really high. We watch a lot of Pretty Dress movies here at the Garcia Wilhelm house. It's weird. I've really enjoyed the it's weird to count them as period pieces, but they are, even though they're sort of alternate history period pieces. A lot of the more recent Tarantino work, I've enjoyed a lot because they're sort of like I really loved Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. I really loved Django Unchained, and even Once Upon a Time in Nazi occupied Germany, but that would be incorrect. Inglourious Bastards. I really enjoy those a lot. And it's also like they don't really count as period films, but like I do love watching some older movies. My dad raised me on movie serials, so watching those and sort of seeing how they considered what they consider good storytelling, just seeing like the 1940s is always really fun for me. I think that answers your question, but I don't know for certain.
That definitely does. No, that answered it.
It definitely did. And I'm glad you mentioned Little Women because, of course, that's the film we're talking about today. But what makes Little Women a good film to you, and why you decided to have us talk about it on the podcast?
Oh, it's just a brilliantly well done story that is just a masterful adaptation that not only examines the novel itself, but the life of Louise May Alcott, and then takes the story and tells it in a non-linear fashion. It uses the language of film in a really interesting and clever way. A lot of adaptations that you tend to see these days are so true to the original work that they don't necessarily translate to the medium that they're in. They're like, some of the earlier Harry Potter films are really good examples where they let's see, how can we say it as true to the book as possible? But they didn't really make the best cinema. What's great about Greta Gerwig's work on Little Women is she clearly loved the work. She wanted to speak to and have a conversation with the author, but also understood, how do I tell this story cinematically? And she does such a great job of breaking the story, putting it back together in a way that is cinematic, exciting, and surprising, which is something you have to that's a skill to make a 100-plus-year-old novel or a 100-plus-year-old story surprising. So that's why I really want to talk about it.
That's an excellent answer. Excellent. All right. So if anyone listening to this podcast is not aware of Little Women, what are you doing? But the film was released in 2019. It was written and directed by Greta Gerwig. It's what you call a coming-of-age period drama film, which is based on the novel by Louisa May Alcott, which was first published in 1868. It is the 7th film adaptation of the novel. The cast includes Saoirse Ronan, Emma Watson, Florence Pugh, Eliza Scanlon, Laura Dern, Timothée Chalamet, James Norton, Louis Garrel, Meryl Streep, Tracy Letts, Chris Cooper, and Bob Odenkirk.
I'm sorry, I'm laughing because I was writing those all out, and I was like, "No, I'm gonna make her say everybody."
Yep, the whole cast is here.
Well, the issue is this cast is so even the small roles are played by pretty big deal actors. So I was like, exactly. I can't leave off Bob Odenkirk.
You can't. No, don't you dare.
These are his Little Women.
Yeah. Don't you dare.
But filming took place up in Massachusetts, and like my one fun claim to fame is I know the background casting director who worked on this, and I know so many behind the scenes stories about this film that I can't share on air, unfortunately. But some fun stuff there. It really had fantastic reviews when it came out and grossed $218 million worldwide. It received 6 Oscar nominations, which included Best Picture, Best Actress, Best Supporting Actress, Best Adapted Screenplay, Best Original Score, and Best Costume Design, which it won. And it was also nominated for 5 BAFTAs and 2 Golden Globes. Just a few awards.
Just a few.
Just a few.
So I'm really excited to be talking about this movie today, and I've had so many people ask me like when we were going to talk about this movie on this podcast because it is my favorite movie of all time. So we were waiting for the right time to do it, and so when Adam suggested it, I was like, yes. When I think about Little Women, there's a quote that Greta Gerwig said in an, I can't remember if it was an interview or a panel when she was talking about it, and she said, I always knew who Jo March was. She was who I wanted to be. And that is definitely me. I literally don't remember the first time I read Little Women. I think I probably read the book for the first time around the age of 8. It was one of the like first proper novels that I read, and I've read it so many times since then. And truly, like, and people joke about this, but it's actually true. Like, my entire personality is just if you combined Meg March and Jo March, that's what you would get.
It's 100% who you are.
I am the combination of the two of them. That's all that there is here. There's nothing more to me. If you know that, then that's it. So I was super excited whenever this movie was announced, but also very nervous because I do actually quite like the 1994 version of Little Women, but I have issues with it. Obviously, whenever there's something that is so formative to your personality, like this book was for me, I think whenever you see it adapted, it's very easy to be like, well, they kind of got that wrong. They didn't really understand this character. But whenever it was announced that Greta Gerwig was writing and directing it, I was like, okay, well, I have faith in Greta Gerwig. And then they started announcing this cast. And it felt like Greta was making this movie specifically for me because Saoirse Ronan and Emma Watson are 2 of my favorite actresses of all time. And James Norton is like one of my biggest crushes. So to have James Norton playing like the crush of my youth, John Brooke, was like, honestly, it's still weird to me whenever I watch it. Like it feels too correct. I'm like, no, this is a fever dream that I made up. But my other really fun thing about this movie is that it was actually the first press screening I was ever invited to. And I will never forget, I was actually at Disney World walking through Galaxy's Edge and checked my phone and got the email inviting me to the press screening. And I stopped in my tracks in the middle of freaking Galaxy's Edge and cried. Because it felt like fate that this would be the first thing that I would get invited to. And also I just wanted to see it so badly. And I got to go see it with my mom, and I cried through like 3/4 of the movie. People think I'm joking when I talk about how much I cry when I watch this, and I'm like, it's not a joke. I wish it was a joke. But it's just a very personal story to me. But yeah, basically, like I've said, I feel really lucky that I exist in a world that this movie exists in because it feels so perfect. And it feels like I rewatched it the other night and I was like, God, I feel like I'm watching my soul reflected back at me. This cast is perfect. I think the costume and production design are gorgeous. I know that some people have like issues with the costume design in this movie because a lot of it is, anachronistic. We'll talk about that later because I also have thoughts on that and why that's true. Which also will come up whenever I discuss the Alcott family. But I think that Greta understands these characters in a way that none of the other filmmakers who've made adaptations of this movie have. And I think that the way that she fleshed out everything by really bringing in stuff about the Alcott family, which again, I'll talk about later, is really brilliant. The way that they fleshed out the characters of Amy March and Marmee, I think is in particular really brilliant. One thing that I was really struck by the last time I watched this was the way in which the men of this film respect the feminine world that is created within it, the way that they are happy to either inhabit this feminine world, in particular Laurie as a character is, or exist on the edges of it. And that's why, like, even in a lot of the blocking of the scenes, the men are standing around the edges of the room with the women in the center of it, which I think is really interesting. And I've read essays on the fact that, like, Laurie was actually one of the first male characters in literature to exist within a feminine space. Typically, if you have male characters in books, they're existing within masculine spaces that women are in, whereas Laurie is very much coming fully into a feminine space. Which makes sense if you think about things like the Bronte novels or Austen's novels even. There aren't many male characters who exist outside of masculine or co-ed spaces, whereas Laurie fully steps into a feminine world, which I think is very interesting. I as you can tell, I've read way too much about this. I love this screenplay. It's my favorite adapted screenplay of all time.
Do you own it?
I do. I do. And I have a PDF on my computer. But I think that, you know, like Adam was saying earlier, the way that Greta sort of took apart this story and put it back together in a way that like actually creates like much more emotional impact, I think is really fascinating. I think really shows that the most important thing in adaptation is understanding the, you know, essence of the work that you're adapting, not getting every detail, although she also includes like a ton of small details. I also just have to say, like, I could talk for years about this whole cast, but I could talk for literal years about Timothée Chalamet as Laurie and the fact that I actually think this is Timothy's best performance, because he, like, I reread the novel a couple of months after this movie came out, and I was like, oh shit, it's literally like he walked off the page. Like, that's kind of crazy. I also will say,
it's funny you say that because I feel like everybody focuses on his other movies, but this truly is one of his best performances, and I have not seen another one where he shines the way that he does in this role.
Right? I think it's an incredibly nuanced performance, and people, I do think it is the kind of thing where if you're not familiar with the novel, you don't realize maybe the depths of this performance that he's giving. Because it really is astounding. And his chemistry with everyone in this film is incredible. Like, he's just got chemistry with everyone. I'm like, all right. But the other thing I have to say is that I quote this movie. My sister and I quote this movie continually. I could honestly say this whole script like inside and out. But in particular, I will share my sister's favorite thing to quote is the bit when Amy says, Joe sits in the back so we can't see her cry. Which is true because that's what I do when my family watches movies in our living room, because I am the crier of the family. But yeah, my sister's a total Amy March. I'm a total Joe/Meg. So this is a very special movie to my entire family. We've seen it many times. She got a little mad at me, I think, because I watched it without her the other night. Yeah.
Adam, can you follow that up?
Yeah.
Well, no, I think so. I hope so. I'll try. Probably not. I'll fail spectacularly. It'd be great. No, it's funny because I have no connection to the story pre-existing the movie. I never read the book. It just wasn't part of the literature that I read growing up. My public schooling failed me in that regard. And if I were to be honest, like even if it was part of my youth, I think that young Adam would have probably been very upset about reading a book about women. I remember very vividly, too much to my chagrin, crying about reading the Peanut Butter and Jelly book, and that was a girl's book. And but and to show you where I've come, like I really enjoy, and I think Maggie and I have talked about this a bit, but like I really enjoy writing and reading about short, female characters. I like reading in writing women's stories. So there's a part of me that really wishes I had read this earlier, but I think that if I had read it earlier, I wouldn't have the appreciation that I do for it now. Mm-hmm. So I went to this movie very, very blind. I didn't even know the story. But I went to my girlfriend who loves watching pretty dress movies. Like, that is a thing that happens in our house, along with watching Hallmark movies, which I balance out, which are like, oh, we're going to watch Doctor Who now. Here's a new Star Wars film. But, I think the balance is I watch pretty dress movies and Hallmark movies, mostly Christmas movies.
They're the best.
Yes,
they're great.
Look, if you're going to watch a Hallmark movie, it should be a Christmas Hallmark movie.
Yeah, there was one that was actually, we watched recently that was actually pretty good. Anyway. So I went to go. I have a season's pass at the Alamo Draft House here in New York, and for those who don't know, it's a dine-in theater that if they kick you out if you look at your phone, talk too loud, so you got to have a really great film experience. And with the season's pass, you can just go see a movie whenever. So I'm like going to the movies on a regular basis, and Little Women comes out, and I'm like, wow, this looks kind of good. It's Greta Gerwig. The reviews are really good. Let's go check it out. So I go to my girlfriend and I say, listen, I'm going to go see Little Women, with the expectation of her saying, oh my God, I really want to see that. Tell me how it is. Instead, she's like, I hate that novel. I hate it so much.
Oh no.
Like, and she goes into a very, very spoiler heavy, and I really can't complain because I was about to stop her from talking. I'm like, please don't spoil the movie. But I really can't say that because it's 100-something years old.
Yeah.
How, like, really the fault's mine at this point. So,
You've had 100 years to read this book out.
There's a whole episode of Little Women about the fact that you can't spoil, or of Friends about the fact that you can't spoil Little Women because it's too old.
Exactly. So I really can't be mad at her, but she lays out very specifically. We can talk about those specifics as we talk tonight, but very specific points about why the story doesn't work for her.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, I hear her and I understand what she's saying, and I have no opinion on the matter because I haven't seen I don't know the story, but I'm like, yeah, okay. And there's a point in the movie where I'm already like, I'm in it. I'm loving the back and the way she's structured the story, moving back and forth in time. That we get to the end, and the thing that my girlfriend hated, they address directly in a way that is very meta and very intelligent, and also felt very true to my own story, which is so much of my free time is spent on my writing, my side hustles, the things that really my creative passions. And there's a lot of people my age who are much more successful because of whatever they've been in, or they've given up on those pursuits and they're like have a job that pays better than mine. They have a family. They're all very stable, where I'm still doing what I'm doing, working every day to get to where I want. And, and seeing Jo March's story about like trying and not stopping and, doing what you can to get to where you are was like struck a real chord with me. So it was the multiple punch of seeing my girlfriend's criticisms addressed. And I was like, and it was one of those things where I got to that moment when I was like, oh, this is what she's talking about. Oh, I'm not okay with this either. This doesn't make any sense. And then the movie does a big trick on me. And I'm like, yes, that's how you do it. And it's a combination of that, the non-sequential storytelling, how well developed all the characters were, and to sort of Jo March's story that resonated with me personally, that just, I left that movie and I go to everyone. I'm like, you need to watch it. Like, I'm hoping that I'm whittling my girlfriend down. Like, look, I get it. You hate the book. I get it. It really addresses all your issues. This is why. Even my mom, like when I was seeing it with my parents during the height of the pandemic, I'm like, Mom, you just need to watch this. Like, it was like, understand that it was like, let's watch Doctor Who, Star Wars, also Mom, Little Women.
I love this.
So, it's interesting. Like the movie means a lot to me, and I look at it a lot. I've watched it maybe 3 or 4 times since I've got it since I saw it in theaters, and I think about it a lot. I think about it a lot more than I expected to. And I definitely cite it as one of the best films of 2019. So yeah, I when you're like, what can you talk about? It was the first thing I thought of, but I figured of course they would have talked about it by now because it's great.
Yeah.
But then there you go. So
yeah.
Yeah.
That's so funny. I was about to be like, yeah, I also think about it a lot. And then I realized, my phone lock screen, which y'all listening can't hear, but they can see, is literally a set photo from this movie. And it has been since 2019. Sorry if I ever get a boyfriend, I'll be like, you can't be my phone lock screen. It's Greta and Sarah show. That can't change.
Don't worry. Mine's like literally the TARDIS. My lock screen is the TARDIS, and then when you open it up, it's actually the inside of the TARDIS. So
okay, wait, that's very cool.
That.
I do love that. Okay,
mine is Din Djarin in a blanket with Baby Yoda next to him, also wrapped in a Yoda blanket, and I'm also wrapped in a Yoda blanket right now. So
we're all so on brand.
Oh my god, yeah, never off brand. Like I'm looking at I'm looking at two TARDISes and my lightsaber right now, and a Porg, and so that's what I'm looking at.
I love that.
But what I think is so interesting is like both Nicole and I have such like a long history with Little Women, and it's really a true testament to how well Greta made this film that somebody walking in completely cold, except for some spoilers, was so impacted by it and felt such a resonance with it. And I think that's just like a true credit to how well done this film was.
I think it's very interesting to think about actually, that the three of us all have like an attachment to this film and it really resonated with us. And the fact that we are all three writers, and I wonder like how much of that is the fact that this is very much a movie for creative people. And I think it's very interesting too, because you have two very different examples of creative people in the movie. You have Jo, who, you know, is continually hustling and grinding and doing what she has to succeed. And then you have like a very different approach to being a creative person in the character of Amy, who sort of decides that if she can't be great, you know, she says, I want to be great or nothing. And she decides that if she can't do it, then she's not going to do it at all, basically. But I do think that I've found that other people who are also creatives in some way, this movie tends to resonate with them.
Yeah. To that point, there's this very unique thing about being a creative that I don't know if normies ever experience. And it's this unquenchable need to write, to create, whatever it is that you're creative of. It's like, no matter what, like you're given a choice, like you can do this or you can work on your writing. And you're like, well, clearly I'm going to choose my writing. You know, I've quit a job because my boss said, like, you can't write while you work here. Like, as in, like, write while you're employed with them. I'm like, well, fuck you. I can't do that. I'm sorry if I can't curse, but you know, I didn't say that, but I thought it very loudly. Yeah, but it's like there's a lot of life choices that one makes as a creative that is isolating in many ways, but also more fulfilling than any other thing you can describe. It's like, yeah, it's really nice that you have a house and like 3.5 kids and, you know, make $1 million, but you know, I don't know if I would necessarily at this point in my life trade it for the chance to work on my graphic novel or my audio drama or whatever.
Yeah.
So, you know, and seeing that in a character on film, that sort of burning passion in Jo March, it's really endearing and sort of validating.
Yeah. I think the film is interesting in that it addresses that sometimes being a creative person is very lonely because, like you were talking about, you make sacrifices and you give up things. And there is that very brilliant scene in which, you know, you see that she's feeling that loneliness because other people her age have something that she doesn't, and particularly obviously in that time period for a woman that was an unheard of sacrifice in many ways. But it is something that I think like resonates as someone who has chosen, you know, the things that they're pursuing over the things that, like you said, normal people their age are doing.
Yeah.
You know, I feel like I'm just going to echo everything that everybody has already like said about this and my own thoughts in the film. But, you know, like Nicole said, like I had a really huge love for the 1994 Little Women. Like I loved it. I didn't think anybody could beat it because honestly, book adaptations are really hard. You know, I'm a big historical novel fan, like Wuthering Heights, Jane Eyre, all the Jane Austens. Like I love them. And I'm so persnickety about adaptations. And so I was like, okay, I trust Greta Gerwig. Like I like what she's done before. I think that she can kind of capture that. But I was so nervous going into this, and I ended up seeing it with my mother, which just seemed like just the perfect combination, to go with. But you talked about it a little bit, Nicole. I really liked how they fleshed out Marmee and kind of reshaped the sisters, not in major ways. They didn't change anything about who they are, but they gave them more to work with, and they made them much more grounded, realistic characters that anybody could relate to. I feel like there's so much potential to see yourself in Amy or Meg or Joe, even if you had none of that background history going into it. And I actually really love nonlinear storytelling. Like I personally have written several stories. Actually, my largest work I've ever written, which is almost 300,000 words long, is a nonlinear story. And so I was super excited to see a nonlinear story done so well, because I feel like people like to knock on nonlinear storytelling as like being a cheap way of like paying things off and stuff in film. And I think this worked so well. And I really love the subtle ways that you could tell. I remember reading a couple of reviews from people who were like, I could never tell when the flashbacks were happening. And I was like, well, like Joe's hair is different. Everyone's wearing like different season of clothing. And it looks different. Like
the color grading is different.
The color grading is completely different. That's what, like, it looks so different. Just open your eyes. I promise you can follow along with it. And I also really love the ambiguity of the ending. I thought that it really paid off for Joe's character and also allowed the reader to write their own ending in a sense. There's a sort of ownership to it where you could choose how it ends based on what you personally needed as a creative watching it and what ending you saw as the fitting ending, which I really appreciated. And I really love this interpretation of Joe. Like, I already knew that I was a Joe. Like, there's no combination for me. I'm not like Nicole. There is no
pure
Meg.
Joe.
I am 100% Joe. When I was a child, my mother used to call me her little Joe. So like I knew I was a Joe the whole time I've been growing up. And it was even funnier when I started writing and my mom was just like, well,
there it is.
I was right. There it is. And this film just like truly confirmed the fact for me. And also this is my favorite interpretation of Professor Bear. I've always been a Professor Bear girl, but like Louis Garrel, like, yes.
I will never forget. I watched this interview where they asked Greta about the fact that like she cast a very attractive man in this role that is written to be like a not very attractive man. And she basically was like, men have been casting beautiful women in parts that aren't meant for beautiful women forever. So I thought, yeah, my Joe deserves somebody good looking. And I was like, thank you, Greta.
Like, yes. He also has a beautiful nose. I know it's like, I don't know if I've said it on, I think I've said it on here before with some other actors, but like I've definitely talked about it on Twitter too. Like he has a beautiful nose. He's in that category of like beautiful noses.
Yep.
Like very interesting face. But yeah, I really like this movie. I wish I had time to rewatch it again before this, but I have seen it 3 times. So I felt like I was good to go. Had a few other screeners I had to get through this week.
Yeah, I saw this movie in the theater. So I saw this movie in the theater 4 times.
I remember.
Yeah, you remember. It's like the most I've ever seen a movie in the theater. And the last time we went, actually 4 or 5, no, I can't remember. But the last time we went, my sister and I were the only people in the theater. And that is like the best time I've ever had in a movie theater because we were just like audibly reacting to everything. Because there was nobody else there. We went like on the last day that it was in Regal's. Because we were like, all right, one more time.
I have a question for you, Nicole, before we move on to the first topic of the night. Okay. Have you been to Orchard House?
I have not. It is like
I have.
Okay, so here's a fun thing. I was planning a trip to Orchard House, like to Massachusetts to go to Orchard House. Specifically in early March of
2019.
Yeah. And then
a pandemic happened.
Yeah, no, literally like whenever the pandemic hit, I was like in the stages of planning a trip to go there and I still have not been able to go.
You might have actually mentioned that on the very first episode of Petticoats and Poppies.
I think I've talked about it before. Yeah. But I will go at some point. It is like my number one place that I want to go.
It's beautiful.
Yeah. So I'm going to talk a bit about Orchard House and about the Alcott family, because as we've all talked about, one of the most brilliant things that Greta does with this adaptation is that she really pulls the history of the Alcott family into the story, because Little Women always was a sort of semi-autobiographical novel, and this adaptation really plays that up a bit more. But Orchard House itself is located in Concord, Massachusetts. It was purchased by Bronson Alcott, Louisa May Alcott's father, in 1857. It sat on 12 acres of land with 40 apple trees, hence the name Orchard House. And the Alcotts lived there for 20 years, from 1858 to 1877. And so Little Women is actually based on Louisa's younger years with her three sisters at Orchard House. Sort of transposes a lot of what happened pre them living there to that setting, that the house that is described is sort of obviously based on Orchard House. But Amos Bronson Alcott, Louisa May Alcott's father, is a very interesting character. And it's interesting because Mr. March is sort of a character whose presence is throughout the novel and the film, but he is mostly absent. He's away at war for most of it. Then Bob Odenkirk comes in and says, "My Little Women," which I don't know why I find that so funny every time he does it, but there's something about it, man. But Bronson Alcott was born in 1799. He was the son of a Connecticut flax farmer, and he was an educator and a leader of the Transcendentalist movement, which was a movement in New England starting in like the 1830s. So it was based on the belief that people are inherently good and can get closer to God through nature. There's all sorts of stuff that goes along with the Transcendentalist movement. They were basically the hippies of their day. He was good friends with like Henry David Thoreau, Nathaniel Hawthorne, Julia Ward Howe, Ralph Waldo Emerson, all that like set of New England thinkers of the time. And he had a school of philosophy that was adjacent to Orchard House. A lot of ideas actually that Bronson had about education are things that we see in schools today, like music lessons and PE and things like that. But at the time, they were considered very radical. And his teaching methods weren't always popular. And the family actually moved like 20 times in 30 years because he was so unsuccessful as a teacher. But his beliefs definitely like factored into how his daughters were raised, and you definitely see that in Louisa May Alcott's writing. He had these principles of duty and compassion, charity, self-expression, which I think are things that we definitely see in the March family in the film. You know, they're very focused on charity work, and they're also very focused on the girls having sort of creative outlets for themselves. You know, not just Joe's writing, but Meg is sort of encouraged as an amateur actress, best piano playing, Amy's art. And Bronson definitely encouraged his daughter's writing career. He even gave her a desk, which is where she sat to write Little Women. They still have it at Orchard House. And he didn't pass away until 1888. Now, what is sort of hinted at in the movie, and it's just definitely based in fact, is Abigail May Alcott, which is who Marmee is based on, was sort of like New England royalty before her marriage to Bronson Alcott. Her great aunt, Dorothy Quincy, married John Hancock, who was the first governor of Massachusetts, and yes, that John Hancock, the signer of the Declaration. Throwback to our National Treasure episode. But she was born in the year 1800, and she was often called Abba, which I thought was kind of cute. And she, before her marriage, worked really tirelessly for causes like abolition, women's rights, temperance. She was a social worker in Boston, from what I could find, like one of the earliest examples of a paid social worker. And she and Bronson had a long courtship, but were eventually married in 1830. Which is interesting because she was 30 years old by the time that they got married and went on to have 4 daughters, which is kind of unusual for the time. But she was definitely frustrated by her husband's difficulties supporting his family. Let's call it that to be polite. But definitely believed in his ideas, and she had a very loving relationship with her 4 daughters. But you know, it's kind of what we see with Marmee in the film, and that's where a lot of what Greta did with the character of Marmee was drawn from, this fact that she is sort of faced with this husband who is more concerned with his ideals than with, you know, providing for their 4 children. And so she is sort of trying to do that on her own while also continuing on the charity work that she's really passionate about. And I think that that makes for a very interesting character, but also Abigail Alcott was definitely a very fascinating woman. So Meg March, my fave, and I do think that this adaptation is the first one ever to get the character of Meg March right and to really give her her due. But she was based on Louisa's older sister, Anna Alcott Pratt, who was born in 1831, basically right after her parents were married. Like Meg, she was considered the most traditional of her sisters. She was a good student. She was a governess. She was described as very gentle and loving, and she did love acting, and she was considered very talented. What I thought was very interesting, she and Louisa helped form the Concord Dramatic Union in 1858, which was a sort of drama club for the town. And she fell in love with another member of the acting troupe, John Bridge Pratt, who was, of course, the inspiration for John Brooke. They were married in May of 1860, which is interesting because it means she was 29 when they got married. So obviously that's sort of a pattern in the Alcott family.
Hey, you mean there's hope for us?
Yeah, so it's not too late for me. No, I thought that whenever I was putting these notes together. But sadly, John died after 10 years of marriage, and left Anna to care for their sons.
Had a good run.
Yeah, right. Like they got a good decade in, and left Anna to care for their two sons, Frederick and John Jr. on her own. Her sister Louisa helped her purchase Thoreau House, which, like, yes, as in that Thoreau, in Concord in 1877 for her to live in with her sons. And she sort of spent the rest of her life caring for her sons and her sister Louisa and her younger sister May's daughter Lulu. And she died in 1893. So definitely had a long, full life. Now, Louisa May Alcott wrote the character of Jo based on herself, which I think is very interesting. And I think that's part of why Jo is such a fully fleshed out character, because she's a character with a lot of flaws as well as a lot of good things. So I think that's, I think if I was writing a book in which I based a character on me and I did not put my flaws into it, my sister would absolutely roast me. So I think that probably may have influenced Louisa as well. She was definitely a tomboy, much like Jo. Oh, so she was born in 1832, which I think is interesting because Anna and Louisa are born right after each other. I think they must. I'm not good with that, but I think they must qualify as like Irish twins, which is the same for Meg and Jo, which explains why they're so close. But she was definitely a tomboy growing up, and from a young age had a passion for writing, and she actually really did write plays for her sisters to act out. Now, Louisa was determined to help support her family. Again, like I said, her dad wasn't that great at it, so she worked as a teacher, a seamstress, a governess, and even a household servant. And she also started publishing poems and short stories from a really young age. Her first book, Flower Fables, was published in 1854 when she was 22 years old. One of her books, which I think this is fascinating, her book Hospital Sketches, which was published in 1863, was about her experiences in Washington, D.C. while she was working as a nurse in a hospital for soldiers from the Civil War. So, Adam, there's your Civil War connection. But Little Women was published in 1868. She was specifically asked to write it by her editor, who wanted like a story for girls. Little Women originally was actually what we now call Little Women, was originally published in two parts. Little Women, which is essentially the first half of the book, and then Good Wives, which is the second half, which is the part whenever they're older. Louisa went on to publish over 30 books and collections of short stories and poems before her death in 1888. Elizabeth Sewell Alcott, which is what the character of Beth is based on, which I think is interesting because she's the only character who is given the actual name of her sister. She was called Beth, Betty, or Lizzie. Sort of all three are used whenever her family's talking about her. But she was born in 1835. She was quiet, very shy. There's not that much known about her. But we do know that she liked animals, children, music, and sewing. So basically everything that we know about Beth. And most of what we know about her actually is from Little Women, because Beth is supposed to be based very sort of strictly on her personality. Whereas with the other sisters, she was taking a little bit more liberties. She had a really bad experience with scarlet fever, like Beth does in Little Women. And she actually died just 2 years after that, though, in 1858, actually right before the family moved into Orchard House. So she never actually lived in the house. And so I think it's interesting because Little Women in some ways seems to be like Louisa's way of sort of transporting her there to this place. And then the youngest sister, who I think is maybe the most interesting of the bunch other than Louisa, Abigail May Alcott. And I do not know how her last name is pronounced. I think it's Nair Ricker, which is who Amy is based on. She was born in 1840, which puts her significantly younger than the other girls. What I think is really interesting, Maggie, you'll appreciate this. It means that she's 8 years younger than Louisa, which is the age gap that I have with my little sister. So, who is a total Amy March. So, that was a very fun thing that I found out. She was blue-eyed, blonde, considered like the prettiest of the sisters. She was obsessed with everything elegant, and showed artistic ability from a very young age. She studied art in Boston with Dr. William Rimmer and William Morris Hunt, a name that might ring a bell with some people. Yes. And Louisa actually used the money that she earned from selling Little Women to send May to Europe on 3 separate trips to study art in London, Paris, and Rome. There was, from their letters, a sense of competition between her and Joe, and they definitely had a tumultuous relationship for many years. But May eventually married a Swiss businessman and musician named Ernest in 1878, and the couple lived in Paris. She gave birth to a daughter who she named Louisa May in November of 1879. And the daughter was mostly known as Lulu to differentiate her from her aunt Louisa. But May died just 7 weeks after her daughter was born in early 1880, and she actually in her will stipulated that Lulu be sent to Louisa to be raised by her. And so Louisa raised Lulu as her own child, sort of between her and their older sister, Anna, which I think is very interesting. And it's an interesting thing because obviously Louisa May Alcott actually did go on to write more books that are set after Little Women, including, God, Maggie, what are all the names of them? Little Men, Joe's Boys. Is that it?
I think those are the only 2 I have read.
Yeah. I think that's it, because I think it's that there's 4 originally, but Little Women and Good Wives are now combined. Yes. And obviously a lot of that is taking a lot more liberties with what happened in their real lives. But I do think that the story of the fact that Louisa ends up raising her niece is very interesting. I think that not many people know about. But in any case, you can visit Orchard House today. I have not.
It's beautiful.
It opened to the public in 1912, but was restored actually not that long ago with a $400,000 grant from Save America's Treasures, which is an organization that's, set up to help restore historic sites. They do offer guided tours. They have, I thought this was fascinating, 80% of the original furniture from the house, which is kind of wild. And the Little Women cast did some interviews there during their press tour, which was very fun. They've got all sorts of things there, though, like family photos, artwork of May's. They have Anna's marriage certificate, different stuff there. But what's fascinating is if you have seen the movie, you know exactly what Orchard House looks like, because they did a full recreation of Orchard House for the March family home in the film. It is almost a perfect recreation of both inside and outside the house, with the one stipulation that it's significantly larger because they had to make the rooms bigger to be able to fit the camera crews into them. The only other difference is that the house in the film has decorative gingerbread shingling, which is not on the actual house. But they built it in Concord, where the original house is. It has since been dismantled. But the designer Jess Goncourt visited Orchard House at least 10 times, she said, to take measurements and photographs of everything so that they could replicate it basically perfectly. And I thought this was interesting. This is the only version of Little Women that has ever filmed entirely in Massachusetts. Although Katharine Hepburn did visit Orchard House to promote the 1930s version of the film in which she played Jo, and they took promotional shots outside of the house.
Interesting.
Yeah, but I just think that's very interesting that Greta was like so dedicated to sort of bringing out the fact that Little Women is based on the Alcott family, that she was like, we're going to recreate the whole freaking house, which is a level of dedication I don't think goes into most adaptations ever. And that's my rant done. Hopefully I've not put anyone to sleep.
That was a lot. I mean, I feel like I just had a history lesson that I I was not anticipating, but I really appreciate it because it actually gives a lot of context to the film that I was not aware of. So thank you.
Yeah, there's honestly most of that information comes from Orchard House's website, which is very thorough. If anyone wants to find out more, highly recommend looking at their website. I've not been, but I'm still going to say I really recommend going there because I'm sure it's amazing, and Maggie can attest to the fact that it's great. And one day I will get there. I promise myself.
Now Adam gets to regale us with something.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I get to regale. So you talked about how this film is a really good example of adaptation. We talked about it already.
Mm-hmm.
And I sort of insinuated this at the beginning. What has fascinated me about the movie is that merger of not just restructuring the book to be more cinematic, the merger of the Alcott's actual life and putting it into the text of the film. But there's also that meta quality of sort of shaping the narrative in a way that, again, reflected Louisa May Alcott's actual life. So one thing that I had sort of implied was that my girlfriend was really not a big fan of this book for a very specific reason. And that reason is the professor. She is not a fan of that plot point because she feels like the entire book is like she's growing up with this God, why am I blanking on his name now? Laurie, thank you. I was going to call him Julie for some reason. So she grew up with like Joe and Laurie are like clearly sort of like in that first half of the book implied to be together, and then cut to the second half of the book, and all of a sudden he shows up and he's married to Amy, and it's to my girlfriend's mind, it sort of betrayed the characters and the setup, and then all of a sudden she gets like randomly put together with this professor who is, in her opinion, very dry and nowhere near as charismatic, or there's not the connection that Joe had with Laurie. So that was a big issue that she had with the book. So I understand, like, this was like a 30-minute rant that she went into about why she hates the novel because of these choices that just don't make sense. Because like they had to have the girl get together with someone, so they just introduced this professor. I then go into the movie anticipating this, and I get to the point when like all of a sudden this professor shows up. Obviously, like the story is told not in a non-linear fashion, but we get to the point when she's going to tell the professor how she feels and meets him at the train station. And in my mind, I'm like, this feels really forced. This feels out of character. I liked how they handled her turning down Laurie. It felt very true to the character. It was like, I just can't give you what you're asking. Having been on both sides of a conversation like that, they suck, but also it felt believable. So then when the professor shows up and all of a sudden, like, you're clearly in love with him, and I'm like, the hell is this coming from? Like, I don't see this. And they go through that whole thing, and I'm sort of like, oh, this is what, like, the movie in my mind is going from like an A+ to like an A to an A-. I'm like, I can't, and this is because of the story choice. I'm like, I can't get behind this narrative choice. It doesn't work for me. And then all of a sudden they cut to like her talking with the publisher, and it's like, no, like, you will have to get back together with someone. Like, it's a woman's book. This is what you need. She's like, well, no. And it's this whole like this very really interesting choice of letting Jo March be the stand-in for Louisa May Alcott, and her choosing to define, all right, if I'm gonna give up this is what you're giving me. Like, if I'm gonna betray my characters, you're gonna keep my name on this. You're gonna give me more percentage. You're gonna let me do all these different things. And then you have this ending, which is, again, we've already mentioned this, it's up to the viewer's interpretation. You know, I definitely see it as what we're looking at is the novel, like where the whole family is together in the school. In my mind, that is the novel, Little Women. That's the novel within the movie. That's what we're seeing. This is Joe's novel that we're looking at, and that she doesn't end up with a professor. The professor is not probably even a real person. He is something created for the novel. So what we've been seeing isn't necessarily the actual events. We're seeing the book that she wrote. And you can kind of tell where things diverge. So I loved that choice because, and I think Greta Gerwig said it in an interview, like the girl got the book. Like that was like, you know, instead of girl gets boy, it's girl gets book. Like, and as a writer, as someone who is, you know, finally meeting with editors on projects that I've been working on for decades, it's like, oh yeah, yeah. Like, you know, girl gets book. That is my kink. You know, it's just like, yeah, like
that's the truest love story.
Yeah,
right
that's the
there.
truest love story. Like, you can tell, it's just like this passion that she has, and she's so desperate and hunting for that she gets. And that is so...
Jo March was married to her work.
Yeah, and it's really satisfying. And like, I also love that it's like an interpretation of who Louisa May Alcott was. You know, on the flip side, and sort of connected to that, is my girlfriend also really went into this long, you know, as part of this like diatribe. And I want to be clear, like one of the reasons why I fell in love with my girlfriend, the reason why I'm like 10, we're like closing in on 10 years together, is sometimes, as much as it terrifies me, I love how passionate she is. Like I like
healthy fear is good.
Healthy fear. Like I like that she challenges me. Like I like that she'll sit there and say to me, like, this is why you're wrong, this is why I think this is what I prefer from a story, or this is why I definitely need, in my own relationships, I need people who are passionate about something. I've dated too many people like, so what do you like? Well, like, I like stuff. I'm like, okay, that's great. I like stuff too. Any specifics? No. So mind you, like when I'm saying it's like a diatribe, it is, she's coming from a place of passion and understanding, and
was it her TED Talk?
Yeah.
Yeah, but also it's just like, you know, I got a lot of TED Talks. So I say this in like, you know, diatribe, I'm not using in a pejorative sense. I'm saying in a very, like, you know, I understand where she's coming from. So one of the things she said during this discussion of why she really didn't like Little Women was, why was Laurie ending up with Amy? Like, it just didn't make any sense to her. It's like, you know, here's like this really passionate guy with like the most like, oh, I'm so pretty, and like, like very superficial character. It just didn't make sense to her in her mind. And that was another one of those moments where I came home to her and I was like, they answered all of your problems. Not only did they just answer like how how does she end up with a professor? Like, they kind of give you that out. They give you the out. Like, yeah, if you want it to be, she got it with the professor, it's there, but also maybe not. But the Amy issue, I was like, she's like, we were talking about this in the car, like maybe like 3 or 4 weeks ago, because I brought up, I'm like, I really want you to watch this movie. And she's like, I just don't understand like why Laurie would get together with Amy. I'm like, that's the thing. They talk about that, and that sort of expansion upon Amy's story and Laurie's courtship is really, really endearing. And it's I like how you see Amy grow as a human, and you totally believe that Laurie would end up with her in this version, because she's clearly a person of passion, which is obviously something that Laurie is looking for in a woman. You know, she grows from being this, like, I just want to like have this, and this. There's something more that whole like, I want to be great or nothing. She gains a lot of depth. So it's all to say that what really struck me, and I've sort of said this before, what really struck me about this film is it is such a great example of adapting a pre-existing work. And something that I have been thinking a lot about in relation to a number of franchises and a number of films is I think there's a lot of this idea of trying to recreate something that is already pre-existing. And those are successful to differing degrees. A conversation I had recently with a friend of mine after a recent film is one thing that I loved about Indiana Jones and Star Wars, those movies that I really appreciated and mentioned at the top of the podcast, is that what makes them such cultural touchstones is Lucas and Spielberg and a lot of the people of that time made, with Indiana Jones specifically, they said, we want to make a movie that feels like the movie serials we watched growing up as kids. We can't really remake them, but what does it feel like to watch that movie? So they looked at those and they broke it down and created something original. They created something that like spoke to that sense of rewatching it. A lot of films today of franchises sort of treat the things that we saw with this awe and respect that not even the original creators had. There's that to a degree in the sequel trilogy of Star Wars. There's that in Ghostbusters Afterlife. There's that in Jurassic Park. There's a lot of different things where, rather than necessarily moving the story forward, they talk about like, how do we let's double back on the things that we liked before. This is all to say what Little Women does, that the most successful films like Indiana Jones, like the original Star Wars films, like several other franchises, like some of the best stuff that like stands the test of time, is Greta Gerwig made a movie that made you feel like you're reading the novel for the first time. And I think that's what I get out of it is this is what Greta Gerwig felt reading this book. This is what, like, in the same capacity that, like, and it's a completely different thing, but there's the Timothée Chalamet connection. It's with Dune. Like, Dune was like, what does this feel like for Denis Villeneuve when he first read Dune, right? That's, again, I don't know your opinions on those films, and but I think it's a good example. Like, this is what it felt like.
No, I had to laugh because I was like, yep, the film, beginning of it felt like me beginning to read the novel. Confusing.
Yeah. So it was, so I think that's like what with Little Women specifically, I do think it's a really great, a really great example of how a filmmaker can make something based on something pre-existing that feels really original. And part of that is the way she broke the story and, taking the two books and sort of mixing and matching them. Because one, I think it showed how these characters grew, and it kept the audience, at least for me, like genuinely surprised by how the story works. And I think in some ways, I kind of like when I found out that the book wasn't told in a non-linear fashion, because like you, Maggie, like a lot of my stories are told in non-linear narratives, and the project that I'm working on right now, one of the projects I'm working on right now, actually takes that motif and actually makes it sort of it takes it from being like the actual meta to sort of text, like it actually, I'll talk about it later, once we're off. But so I really appreciated the non-linear storytelling. And I think it helped deepen the narrative. So yeah, that is my rant.
Okay, I've gotta make comments.
Please.
This is great. I'm sorry. I'm really passionate about adaptation and about remaking stories and new iterations of stories. And my whole thing for them, and I think that this is, really also what you're getting at, Adam, is that like you have to have a reason to remake a story.
Yeah.
And I think that that's the issue with a lot of adaptations these days, is that they get made and in particular, remakes of things get made without a real reason other than capitalism.
Yep.
Yep. And I think that like Little Women is a great example of like, did we need another version of Little Women? Actually, yeah, we did, because Greta had a very unique vision. The other one that I cite is, do we need another version of Cinderella? Yeah, we needed Kenneth Branagh's version. Because he had an actually unique view on what the message of that story is that no one had brought across before. And he wanted to also reinvent a lot of the characters to give depth to characters like the prince that had never been given depth before. And that's the same thing that Greta does with Amy here. And it's very funny for me in that I also had those feelings growing up of like why John Brooke is my man, but I love Laurie. I love him as a character. I think he's fascinating. In the book, and this is one thing that never gets pulled through to adaptations, he's like a wannabe creative. He like dabbles in writing operas, but can't really commit to it, which I think is a really interesting juxtaposition with Jo.
And interesting too that he ends up with Amy, who also has that creative energy. It's like he wants to be close to that energy that he can't fully harness.
Because his mother was an opera singer. Yes. He's got mommy issues. It's fine. That's how you know I've been podcasting for too long. But, I think that I had those same feelings that you were talking about your girlfriend having, Adam. Like, I was like, why does Amy, who's so annoying, end up with, like, this great guy, like, and Jo's, just kind of, like, oh, I'm like, okay, you were so into her, Laurie. What happened? Like, real loyal there. And it's funny for me because my sister, from the first time she saw a film adaptation and then read the novel when she was young, like, loved Amy. She was like, this is me. I am this. I was like, why would you want to be Amy March? Like, I was like, I see it, but like, why are you so proud of it? Like, and I think that what's interesting is Greta Gerwig saw something in Amy that I think a lot of people didn't. The ways in which Amy is continually measuring herself up to Jo, the ways in which Amy is also striving, to be that creative person, but approaching it in a very different way. And also the ways in which Amy, and I think it is there, like from a very young age, is infatuated with Laurie, but gets sort of pushed to the side because of Jo. And I think that one thing that is very brilliant about this adaptation that is something that failed in previous adaptations is having, even, people make fun all the time of Florence Pugh playing a 12-year-old in this, but I think actually having the consistency of the same actress playing Amy the whole way through the movie is what makes Amy and Laurie work. Because in other adaptations, often like in the 94 adaptation, they've had two different actresses playing her.
Yeah. And
so there's no like real through line. There's no connectedness between what we see of Amy and Laurie interacting when she's younger and then when she's older. And I think that actually does sort of play into it, that we're able to see that Florence Pugh's Amy very clearly has a crush on Laurie before she even meets him. Like, there's that great part where they're talking about him. She's like, he's half Italian. Isn't that romantic? And we sort of see her grow into that. And I think that then, because we've seen that childless infatuation, that whenever she completely dresses him down and she's like disgusted by what he's become whenever she meets up with him in Europe, it means a lot more than whenever in previous times we've seen it where it's like a different actress doing it. And so I think that like that, the way that she reinvented that character is really brilliant. And like that in and of itself would be a reason for this adaptation to exist. Just because it is a new reading on the character that I think is something that I think about this often too, that like Louise May Alcott was writing this, the book is written, it's not meant to be from one person's perspective, but let's be honest, it's from Jo's perspective, because Louisa is Jo. And thus, in some ways, I'm like, okay, yeah, I think that Amy as a character got gypped kind of in the original novel because it was her older sister's view of her. And Greta is able to tease out a little bit more of who that character really is and who May Alcott really was. And I think that's everything that you said about, why this adaptation is so great is true. And I think that it also really shows that, Greta has talked about that she grew up with Little Women, that it was highly influential for her. And I think that you can kind of see how comfortable and familiar she is with this material, that she was able to pull it apart and put it back together in this way. It has a very lived feel to it. It has a very like lived in quality. And I think that is because Greta was so familiar with it that she could easily take everything apart and know how to put it back together. She didn't need like a manual, essentially. And I also think, you can tell in the fact that Saoirse like heard that Greta was doing this movie and like went up to her at an event and was like, I need to play Jo March in your movie. And Greta's like, okay, well, like, we'll talk. We're gonna do casting. She's like, no, I have to do this. Like, yeah, she was like, no, you don't understand. I am your Jo March. And I think that also speaks to the fact that like these were people who are very passionate about the story that they're telling. They're not people, Greta and Saoirse didn't just sort of sign on to this with no previous experience with these characters. So, yeah, that's me ranting again, but like I warned y'all, and this is also like to any of our listeners, this is part of why I've held off on doing an episode on this movie, because I knew that I couldn't not rant.
Yeah, but like it's interesting because it's a story, and I think so much that has to do with the adaptation of it. It's interesting. Let me rephrase, and you can always edit this later, but you don't have to. Let everyone hear how much of an idiot I am. What I think is really fascinating is it is the way Greta Gerwig put together the movie, and the way she told these characters' story. It feels very modern, and it feels modern in a way that I would say like Marie Antoinette tried to do but didn't necessarily succeed in. I had to rewatch Marie Antoinette recently for work, which is always a weird statement to say.
Yes, because you interviewed her.
I did.
Right?
Yes, I did interview Kirsten Dunst, and we did talk about Little Women, but very briefly. But
Amazing.
That movie was trying to be a modern interpretation of a period piece. And I don't think that film ever found the balance. I think it always felt like when it got modern-ish, it kind of like tipped over. And I think this film feels modern in the way that the story is told, the way they perform, the way the characters are performed, the way the script is put together. But it's still a period piece, and it's a really it's an A+ film. It's really one of my it's easily one of my favorite films. Just because I think about how it was made, I think about the story, I think about the characters, more often than I ever thought I would.
That's a really great point of how modern it feels, and to bring it all full circle. I think that one difference there is that the thing about Marie Antoinette is it is like a sort of modern, it's attempted to be like a modern story about a topic that is not modern at all. Like there's nothing about Marie Antoinette as a historical figure that has anything to do with modernity. Let's be very honest. Like, whereas the Alcotts were transcendentalists, they were what we would consider very modern figures. At their time, they were considered just kind of weird. But a lot of their ideas, they were the hippies of their day. A lot of their ideas were very progressive and forward thinking. And that's reflected in Little Women. And I think that lends itself so well to a movie like this that does feel so modern because it fits its subject. It fits these women who are pursuing careers in a time when women were not expected to pursue careers, and pursuing creative projects at a time when that was frowned upon for women. And so I think that, how modern the film feels fits so well with the way that Louisa May Alcott's story and the whole Alcott family is sort of pulled into it, which again, just I think really does speak to like Greta's talent and her vision as well, like as sort of as an auteur or whatever. But the fact that she was able to recognize that this is a piece very specifically that you can put a modern approach to and still have it feel properly set in its period.
It's so interesting that you're both talking about like the modernity of this film, because when I was doing my research today about costumes, there was quite a bit of conversation about Marie Antoinette, as well as A Knight's Tale. And they were talking about, this one particular article I was reading was talking about how certain types of film lends themselves to forgiving anachronism happening within it. And I think, Nicole, we've talked about this before with Mary Queen of Scots, how they used fabrics that were not accurate for that time period, but they worked, and those little changes really work. And they talked about Marie Antoinette more or less kind of hits the marks in some places, fails in others. A Knight's Tale was really intriguing in the way that there's certain songs that play and people sing along to and nobody bats an eye, and like there's certain ways to like commit to the modern elements that creep into it. One of the things, at least for me, as somebody who is very vested interest in historical costuming, considering my mother, this film annoyed me in one small little minor detail, which I feel like is like such like a tiny thing, but the hair infuriated me in this film because it was hanging down, and a lot of times it was just like lank and like it wasn't doing anything. It wasn't like big fancy curls, hot curlers or something like that. It was just there. It was just chilling, natural hair, which would not have been how they would have worn their hair during this period of time. They would have had it up, lots of intricate stuff. Just look at all of the Harper's Weekly from the time, all of the women's guides. Hair would have been up. It's fine. I let it slide. They're modern. They're hippies.
Because I was actually paying attention to this the last time I watched it, and what I do think is interesting, all of the other women in this film have their hair up. Yep. Yes. And so I do think it is the hair team and Greta and whoever's decision this was
making this vision of modern women
of them not fitting within the rest of the people in their town. There is an element to Little Women in which these four girls are essentially, it's funny that Emma Watson is one of them because there's like a Belle element to it where like everybody else in the town is like these strange girls.
Yeah, but this does a better job.
I mean, well, yeah, obviously.
Yes.
I mean, let's be honest. Yeah.
Yes. And I feel like it's like such in the weeds. I'm like, this is that one thing. But I feel like of all the things that I could have like an issue with, hair is like such a like whatever, like, because there's nothing else wrong with it.
There's so many period dramas that have women with their hair down who should not have their hair down, like in any way, shape, or form.
It's
like,
honestly, it's the one thing that my mom and I discussed the most about period dramas. Like their hair was completely wrong.
And at least in this one, there is like, you can argue like a character choice behind it.
Exactly. I'm like, I can
even though I will say there are times where I'm like, I get it. You want them to stick out from everybody else here. You want to show that they're not doing what they're meant to be doing. Like, especially for Jo, it makes sense that like, she just can't be bothered to put her hair up or whatever. And if you notice, Amy is the person who, once she's older, consistently does have her hair in the correct styles.
Yes.
But there are a few choices where like, there's a scene where Meg has her hair in braids, and I'm like, why this? Like, what was this look? Like,
I hate that look so much.
Yeah.
And then like, I know that a lot of the historical costuming groups that I'm in were quite upset about the lack of bonnets, which were very much in vogue at the time. But honestly, that's one of the ones that I'm like, nah, you're wrong, because bonnets are so annoying to work with. I've worn them on stage. They're not fun. I was going to have to wear them for a film that I ended up not working on. But they're so annoying because they don't stay on. They block the lighting. They're terrible for actual scene work. So I totally commend them for being like, yeah, no, we're ditching the bonnet.
There's also a whole like plot line in the book about how Jo never remembers to wear a hat. Like,
exactly. Like it works. Stylistically, it was a solid choice. That's the one I forgive them for, like, wholeheartedly. Like, you got it. Hair, it's a hard one for me. But the costumes were designed by Jacqueline Duran, who is best known for her costume design on the 2017 Beauty and the Beast. Anna Kernia, Pride and Prejudice. Clearly she has a thing for Keira Knightley films. And she is also doing the costumes on the upcoming DC film, The Batman. She won Best Costume Design, as we mentioned earlier in the episode, at the Oscars for Little Women. In an interview that she did with EW, Entertainment Weekly, Jacqueline said, I tried to think a bit more about the girls as being part of a radical family and about their life in the countryside and about how they may have lived. and what we know and how we know that the Alcotts lived. I tried to bring all of that context into the interpretation I did of the costumes. I think that it was about bringing in a kind of new life to Victorian girls, keeping it Victorian, but not doing it in the way that we're used to seeing it. And I think that they perfectly captured this. We touched on it a little bit just a few seconds ago about like they're living out in the country. They're much more modern. It works. I love the vision that they took with this. She also talked about how she was tasked in creating very distinctive styles for each of the sisters, not only to differentiate them to the audiences, because some people are face blind, but also trying to pick color palettes that not only matched some of the color cues that come from the book, but also things that Greta was working with in the scene composites, and how she was wanting certain scenes and colors to kind of move together through both the flashbacks and the present scenes. Meg in particular, I really liked what she talked about with Meg. She mentioned that she really played with the pre-Raphaelite style for her, which was this very romanticism aesthetic of not only clothing, but also hair, that whole look that she was sporting at her wedding with the delicate lace and the free-flowing hair and the flower crowns, all very much pre-Raphaelite. Anyone who knows me knows this is exactly what I'm talking about, the pre-Raphaelites, because I love a good Dante Rossetti portrait. And I really think that Emma Watson's character evokes a lot of that styling from those portraits. And so I love what they did with her character creation. And then Jo, of course, being this very tomboyish character, she has a lot of very boyish clothes, which is then further underscored by having her and Laurie swapping a lot of wardrobe pieces. Which is this subtle nod that not only kind of shows that she's this more tomboyish character, but also that they're like intrinsically connected to each other.
I have to point out.
I know, yes.
The best one here, I'm sorry, this is my favorite detail about the whole film, is that the fact, whenever they're seeing Meg off to this like party that she's going to, and Jo sort of jokingly gets down on one knee and like gives him her ring, the waistcoats that they are wearing in that scene are then flipped to his actual proposal to her. And they're wearing each other's waistcoats from the previous scene, which is, I think, the most fascinating costume choice that has ever been made in a film of all time. But it's that level of detail that like they're so close that they're literally sharing each other's clothing, and sort of the flip of that proposal there, I think, is so interesting.
Yes. It was really interesting. I found an interview that she did with Vogue where she talked about how she chose to dress Timothy as Laurie, because apparently the suits that were designed for him had to take some artistic liberties because he apparently did not look good in the actual jackets that would have been concurrent with the 1860s, which were a much more boxy shape. And if you look at Timothy, like, as a costumer, I'd be like, no, he absolutely cannot wear these things. He'd look like some sort of like boy wearing his father's clothes, because he's just very light. He's very thin boned, very Victorian ghost boy.
He's like a
Victorian ghost boy.
To life.
That's hilarious.
He is a Tim Burton character. Yes.
I always say he's like a little Victorian sickly child.
He is.
And you have to dress in ways that don't emphasize that.
And I just love that it was simply because he just would not look right in the 1860s clothing. And honestly, I think that ended up working to their benefit, because the styles that they ended up putting him in were these styles that then looked really good on Jo. And so it ended up like inadvertently working to their favor, which, costuming pulls it all together. But, overall, I think that they've done really fantastic work on this film and this adaptation. And Greta clearly knew what she was doing, not only with the source material, but with just the style that she was looking for. In all of the scenes, the costumes are so specific and so planned, which I love seeing, because sometimes you'll watch a historical film and you'll instantly recognize that they went to the BBC studio lot, they pulled all the costumes from this period and just threw it on people. It's like one of my favorite hobbies is finding dresses that are swapped between BBC One productions and sometimes ITV. I think they have access to the same studio. Yep. And finding these pieces that are just traded throughout from like, sometimes you'll see pieces from the 1970s still being used. But it sometimes, to me, it messes with where the director is trying to go with things, because I know that's a budget cutting measure, but directors have such very clear-cut visions for color composition in their scenes, and being able to work with your designer to create these dresses that not only match color-wise, but also fit the shapes that you're trying to create in scenes. I think it helps create an even better film. Because I always say that you can have a really bad film, but you put them in pretty costumes and most people will be happy. So like costuming is really important. Most people are visual. But I think it's so fresh, and it's still rooted in the authenticity of that time period, but it's also modern, like we were saying. So that's my rant about costumes.
No, that was great. Well, thank you so much, Adam, for coming on.
Oh, my pleasure.
Join us. This has been our 35th episode about Little Women. And I also
yes, our 35th episode Little Women.
We're doing great. And I do want to, this is me going off the plan. I just want to give a shout out to a film that has just come out, because I think it actually ties into like everything that we've talked about, which is Tick, Tick, Boom, which is now out on Netflix, which is a really good adaptation. I think it's one of the best examples of a musical being adapted from the stage to the screen. And it is now out on Netflix. It also has a very modern feel to it while still feeling correctly of the period. And I think is another piece that sort of ties
the 1990s.
They do a 1990s.
Well, late 80s, early 90s.
Late 80s and early 90s, but they also do a music video homage to that early 90s that is so spot on. And I'm going to do a mini rant on this, because like it is so hard to recreate an era of, whether it be filmmaking, of music video, of storytelling, and holy crap, like every single shot in that little music video is like, yep, that I would believe this thing existed. So yeah.
Like I truly had a moment where I wondered if that was something that they just put in from them.
No, like, and it's all credit to Lin-Manuel. It's like, I mean, or at least the people that he surrounded himself with to make sure that like, this looks authentic, because here's a trick, guys, to making really good any good storytelling is surrounding yourself with people who are significantly more talented than you. It's the only way to do it.
Yep. And I think it's also a story about being a creative person, and about it also has that same parallel of someone who decides that they essentially want to be great or nothing, and realizes that it's not happening and chooses the other path, and that's with someone who is determined to see out the struggle. So I think that it actually, like, now it's very much clicking for me in my brain, like, oh, that's why I like that so much. There's
a specific a line that Lin-Manuel said during the press rounds that still sticks with me. And I shared it on Twitter, but it's basically like,
you did.
It's a really long road, and it's, you're going to be like, all your friends are also really talented. They're all going to go away, and you're going to be alone. And are you okay with that? Because it's going to be worth it, but you have to stick with it. And it's like, I needed to hear that this week.
Yeah, you're like, oh, you're talking directly.
I listened to that like 10 times, and I was like, yes, thank you for saying this. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
But I had to plug this film because I do think it speaks to a lot of what we talked about on this episode, and it is now out on Netflix.
Yes. But we would love to hear from our listeners on social media and to hear what you think of Little Women. Adam, where can our listeners find you? And also give a little plug for the Green Llama.
Well, you can find me on Twitter at Adam Lance Garcia. Also on Instagram at Adam Lance Garcia. I also have a TikTok that I've not completely abandoned, but it's there. That's also at Adam Lance Garcia. Basically, if you type in Adam Lance Garcia to any sort of search engine, you'll probably come up with me, and I'm sorry for that. And if you're interested in listening to the Green Llama audio drama, which features our own Maggie Lovett in a recurring role, you can basically type in the Green Llama on Audible, on iTunes, on Spotify, on Amazon Music, really any podcast or podcatcher that you prefer. Just type in the Green Llama. That's Green Llama with one L, like the Buddhist Llama, and you'll pick it up. Also, you can even ask for it on your Alexa. It's kind of nuts. I'm sort of shocked at like when that happened,
wild.
and I was a giddy schoolboy after that. But yeah, it's basically the quick line pitch. It's a 1940s serialized audio drama that is kind of like Indiana Jones meets Batman the Animated Series in terms of style. And yeah, Maggie's really good in it. So you should just listen to it just so you can hear Maggie.
There we go.
I'm flattered.
You can find us on social media at HTATM Podcast on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. You also reminded me that we do have a TikTok account for the podcast.
Also woefully.
Which has a few videos. I think mostly it's just, there's one of me making fun of Matt Damon. Definitely check that out, people.
Matt Damon.
This is Matt Damon's least favorite podcast.
This
just so you know.
Officially. You can find Maggie at Maggie of the Town, and you can find me on all social media at Nicole Ackman 16.
You can listen to our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and on the Earglue Media website, and of course on Audible. If you like what you hear, don't forget to leave us a rating on Apple Podcast and over on Podchaser. Every few episodes, we will be reading your reviews, so be sure to leave us one if you would like to be featured.
We'll be back soon with another Friendsgiving episode as we continue to look at period films from a history and film perspective.
You've been listening to Petticoats and Poppies.
History Girls at the Movies. I don't know why I always talk like a robot whenever I test to see if like
It's really like this robot is like a through line in today's episode.
I have no idea what you're talking about.
there
As a normal human man, I believe that everyone has deep parts of them, and they are diverse in so many ways. Why are you laughing? I don't understand.
I really hope that Albert uses this as the outro.
That doesn't just sound like a robot. That sounds distinctly like a droid.
Is that so surprising? Wow. The Star Wars guy likes to talk about Star Wars. Wow.